So our next speaker in this section is Rachel McGovern, Head of Department of German UCC, with a paper titled The State of Exception, Rereading Carl Schmitt in a State of Pandemic Lockdown. Welcome, Rachel.
Thank you very much, Paul, and thank you all for having me. Thank you, Agnes, and everyone for organizing this and for, I'm going to say, tolerating my presence here, because this is very much a new departure for me in terms of my research. So this paper turns to the political philosophy of Carl Schmitt and is aware of its problematic association with National Socialism. But it's also aware that it identifies something about the contradictions inherent in modern plebiscitic liberal democracy, and problems that only really become truly apparent in states of exception, according to Schmitt. These problems are foreclosed, he argues, for convenience under normal circumstances. One of the questions I've been asking myself about my interest in Carl Schmitt is why raise the spectre of Schmitt at all, particularly after his various tamings, including by Agamben. Did that not finish him off? Why expose the contradictions inherent in modern plebiscitic liberal democracy at all? And to these questions, I can only answer curiosity, a wish to understand phenomena on what we comfortably call the right-wing lunatic fringe, phenomena which have a vague and magical appeal if not exposed by deep understanding of their actions as part of, rather than an outlier to, our democratic practices. In this sense, I'm using Schmitt as a kind of Machiavellian, because whatever his personal political allegiance and however abhorrent that was, he identifies something unspeakable and unspoken about the inner workings of liberal democracy and its inverted other, which is the burgeoning extreme right in Europe. By identifying the two manifestations of the same basic modern political theology, Schmittian analysis seems to suggest that the extreme right can only be banished if we are willing to be honest about what a modern liberal democracy actually is. In this context, COVID-19 offers us a useful state of exception. According to Schmitt's reasoning, as a state of exception, COVID-19, its public health measures, its lockdowns, are not to be set over and against the normal workings of modern liberal democracy. Rather, the state of exception is to be understood as an aspect of modern liberal democracy and offers us the possibility of a deeper understanding of the state generally. So I'm using the current state of exception to test Schmittian ideas of exception and the related idea of the sovereign, or the sovereign decides in the state of exception. I'm reading COVID with Schmitt not better to understand pandemics, but rather to understand what they can bring to light of day in terms of the workings of the state. The first quarantine law, to take you back to Dubrovnik or Ragusa, we have from the second part of the 14th century, also during a period of intense plague, one that is thought to have killed a third of the European population. The 40 days of that period of exclusion, first it was Trentino, it was 30 days, but became 40 days, was informed at the time by emerging ideas about incubation periods, but also, and this is very important to a political theology which Schmitt insists upon, by ancient religious traditions of purification. We have Leviticus 12 on the 40-day postpartum period of purification for women who have borne a son, as well as on biblical duration of disasters, Genesis 7:9 on the duration of the flood, that there will be rain on the face of earth for 40 days and 40 nights. The Ragusa law is the earliest recorded legal decision on a pandemic-driven state of emergency, a proclamation that includes details for penalties of its breach and provides the basic form of legislation that we're now so familiar with from the COVID-19 pandemic, restrictions on travel and on human intercourse, with the exception of necessities for life, taking us to the necessitas non habet legem, necessity knows no law. So it's interesting that within the state of exception, there's always this exception for the necessities of life. The Trentino decree is interesting. I have it here in full in its original Latin and then in a poor translation, but it's interesting in terms of the who, the Great Council of 67 councillors and the 34, the majority of one, that carried the vote for a quarantine. So really what I'm interested in the Great Council of 67 councillors. It's unilateral action on a majority of one, who exactly they were individually and collectively, and with what exact authority they acted, who enacted the law and based on what legal protocols and principles, I and the text leave deliberately blank, because this is the fascinating point. The emergence of a sovereign voice at the moment of decision on the exception. But here, of course, one that's diffuse and spread over 67 people, or at least the 34 who carried the majority vote. They proceeded on this majority of one on the advice of Jacob of Padua, the chief physician in the city at the time, who had advised the cordon sanitaire between the city and travellers, isolation and treatment of the sick at designated sites outside of the city. This was not the first act of quarantine in that long plague century, but is the first legal edict and juridic expression of that state of exception under infectious conditions. This paper reads that decision in a way as paradigmatic for all similar states of apparent suspension of the normal legal order, and asks what happens when we regard the situation through the lens of Carl Schmitt's idea of the exception, what we can understand about recent states of exception emerging under coronavirus conditions, and indeed, as Eugene was just saying, post-Brexit, particularly in Northern Ireland. In his infamous work of 1922, Political Theology, written while he was a young professor of constitutional law at the University of Bonn, Schmitt had very specifically defined the exception not as something else, something beyond and unrelated to the norm, but rather curiously as the outermost sphere. I'm sorry, I hope you can see it here. It is ein Begriff der äußersten Sphäre, a term of the outermost sphere. What he means by a concept of the outermost sphere needs to be clarified, but it needs to be clarified in relation to the original German. He also calls it a borderline concept, not in the sense that it stands over and against that which it encloses, the non-exceptional state or the norm, but rather in the sense that it is the most extreme part of what constitutes the norm. In German, the Äußerste has a particular meaning. Außen means, of course, outside, beyond something, separate. While das Äußerste is not exterior to that set, but rather the moment of mostness, its greatest intensity. It is the most of whatever thing it is applied to. The word, in other words, means both inside and out. Außen und das Äußerste, the two faces of the border, that which faces in and that which faces out. It also means sich äußern, to express itself. And it's this disjointed richness of the term that Schmitt, like a kind of jurisprudential Heidegger, enjoys and exploits in his text. It's a very poetic text in many ways. For Heidegger, sich äußern means enfolding out of yourself, stepping out of yourself, but also revealing yourself, like the Greek actor stepping out of the chorus. Why Schmitt opens his work on sovereignty and decisions with reference to the borderline, the Grenzbegriff, or liminal term, requires further elucidation too. He doesn't return to that idea of the borderline concept in the 4 chapters of the work, except to use the related term unbegrenzt about 10 pages later, borderless, limitless, to describe the state of exception. So the state of exception is a liminal term, but also limitless. So I've given you both of the quotes here. The unlimited is the second version of this. The precondition, as well as the content of jurisdictional competence in such a case, namely the extreme case, must necessarily be unlimited. So to begin with, he says, souverän ist der, wer über dem sorry to go back up. Sovereign is he who decides on the exception is the English translation. Souverän ist wer über den Ausnahmezustand entscheidet. And I'm going to come back to the moment of über, which is lost in the translation. It becomes on here. He goes on to say that it's difficult to define a state of emergency simply because it is the nature of such a state that its possibilities remain unbordered. So we move from Grenzfall to the unbordered. Sorry, I've done the slides in a slightly odd fashion. So you cannot define what will happen in the state of emergency because it is in the nature of such a state that its possibilities must remain unlimited. The issue of the English translation here is that the link between the liminal concept of sovereignty, something that only becomes evident in the state of exception, and the limitlessness of the state of exception is lost. So that connection between limit and illimited. The central organizing concept of the border, the Grenze or Grenzfall, between the sovereign and the ruled, between order and chaos, becomes visible as its own vanishing point because we can trace the connection between Grenze, order, and unbegrenzt. The borderline term delimits the limitless, is what he seems to say. That all sounds very, very German and very, I'm sorry that it sounds so Heideggerian. I apologize for it. It's something that is quite clear in the German, but becomes increasingly difficult to articulate in the English. So Ragusa, to come back to that state to which Schmitt does not refer in his jurisprudential theorization of decision-making and sovereignty. It's an interesting case in point because of its structural similarity to Schmitt's conception of the relationship between norm and exception, which he has called a borderline term to borderlessness, a Grenzbegriff to the unbegrenzt. Its city too, and that's why I've superimposed the graphic of how Schmitt kind of conceives of this on top of a 14th century portrayal of Ragusa and its famous city walls. The city's embattled fortifications and simultaneous openness to the sea. You can see the gap here beside the ship in the lower right-hand corner. It is both closed and open to the sea. It has to be as a trading state. So it has embattled fortifications and simultaneous openness to the sea, a bit like our Northern Irish border, as a Mediterranean trade-based economy. Its political situation, where it is both a vassal state of Hungary at the time, but simultaneously a free state of its own. This ambivalent relationship between inside and outside is also set in stark and visible relief by the pandemic state of exception at this time, which insists both on borders, the cordon sanitaire alongside the city walls, and the laws going with the separation of the sick from the healthy, but also on their permeability, the suspension of those laws that you'll see in the original quote, with states of exception within the exception, allowing for necessities. If anything, this makes it a little bit clearer to see Dubrovnik without the superimposed Schmitt. If anything, the pandemic plague of the 14th century it's not incidental to the sick, but it's incidental to this argument in the true sense of the word. It is something that happens, fortuitous or otherwise. It forms no essential part of what we're talking about, but it illustrates something about the state that we find ourselves in. The state of exception, merely according to Schmitt, insistently reintroduces the forgotten or ignored question of sovereignty, which is always there and which is often begged. Where is this sovereignty? Who speaks with the voice of authority? With whom does it lie? So the disease effectively works like tracer ink. It marks out pre-existing pathways within the body politic. The sovereignty, which we prefer as a concept, I don't know what I actually mean by that. I'm just going to skip over that sentence. It's lost its meaning for me. I'm so sorry. Lost in the translation of Schmitt in English, to come back to that question of über or over, who decides on the exception, as it is in the English. Souverän ist, wer über den Ausnahmezustand entscheidet. Going to its etymological root, Schmitt's über refers to the Latin super, which gives us allegedly the Old French souverain, standing over. This idea of above or over is certainly present in ideas of monarchical sovereignty, but it's deliberately foreclosed in legal expressions of sovereignty, he says, in modern democracy. Take, for instance, our Irish Constitution, Article 1 of which offers The Irish nation hereby affirms its inalienable, indefeasible, and sovereign right to choose its own form of government, etc. It is to this circular logic that Schmitt draws our attention. To be sovereign to oneself as a collective, as a nation, places no one over and against another. It imagines a kind of collateral or side-by-side distribution of a quality called sovereignty. Ireland is a sovereign, independent, democratic state, as Article 5 reasserts. The impossibility of standing over and against oneself, according to Schmitt, is the problem of modern liberal democracy, to which Schmitt calls our attention. With his return to the sous over super of sovereignty, of course, what's very important is that sous, S-O-U-S, of sovereign is bafflingly ambivalent. French sous, which means precisely the opposite of over or above, means under and below. And it is to this underneath the surface, this distributed authority that belies the voice of the sovereign under liberal constitutional democracy, that Schmitt draws our attention. Because of time constraints, I'm going to jump forward a little bit and talk about another core argument of these 4 chapters. Schmitt points out that the legal prescription, the law, as we saw with the Trentino, only designates how decisions should be made, not who should decide. It doesn't utter who shall decide. And this raises the question of authority. Who is authorized to make the decision that converts the legal or indeed even illegal maxim into enacted practice? As an abstraction, he says, the law cannot enact the law. We must ask who will decide and who will do. As Schmitt formulates it, what matters for the reality of legal life is who decides. He also determines the genesis of the modern state as the continuation of theological concepts, primarily God as the omnipotent lawgiver in secularized times and by secularized means. He notes that in secularized theories of the state, the exception in jurisprudence is analogous to the miracle in theology. But whereas the prime mover of the miracle is unproblematic, it's clearly God and or other deity, the prime mover in a secularized democratic state is never similarly clear. The agency of decision is often bureaucratically diffuse. It's because of this obscurity, Schmitt suggests, that the modern state often becomes the focus of conspiracy theories. Because of the modern state's failure to identify or reveal where real decision making and sovereignty lies, people are left with a vague sense of some secret prime mover. According to Schmitt, in the absence of a, quote, graceful and merciful Lord who proves by pardons and amnesties his supremacy over his own laws, end quote, we are left with the, quote, inexplicable identity, lawgiver, executive power, police, pardoner, welfare institution. This to an observer, there appears a huge cloak and dagger drama in which the state acts in many disguises, but always as the same invisible person. End quote. The attempt to resolve this back into one manageable person and target can be seen at work, for instance, in the Soros conspiracies of our time. Just as metaphysicians misuse the name of God to cover the cracks in theological arguments, Schmitt claims, so do intellectually limited jurists introduce the name of the state as a mental short circuit. So they invoke the state, whereas previously people invoked God, while those without the necessary juridical expertise introduce the idea of the conspiracy. Sorry, I've skipped the text here. So if, as is the modern tendency, we imagine sovereign power as resting in and with the state and speak only of the sole supremacy of the state, we are forced to imagine the state as an abstract, quote, as an abstract person with a monopoly of power, if not as an actual mysterious person whom we imagine at the heart of a conspiracy. In other words, to quote Schmitt again, religious fiction is replaced by the juristic fiction, end quote. The natural progression from a theocentric worldview to the modern secular reinvention of the state is central to the Schmittian theorization of sovereignty and to his reintroduction of the idea of a political theology, which emphasizes the role played by religious thought in politics. Within that transition from a theological worldview to a democratic worldview, the people, understood as a collective, whether the mob or the electorate, needs to assume the qualities of the displaced deity. However, quote, the unity that a people represents cannot have the decisionistic character of a god or a monarch. How can 5 million people decide anything, one might ask. Nevertheless, even in modern republics, the quote Schmitt again, after effects of the idea of God remain recognizable. In America, he continues, this manifested itself in the reasonable and pragmatic belief that the voice of the people is the voice of God. As a result, quote, the people hover above the entire political life of the state, über, just as God does above the world, über again, as the cause and end of all things, as the point from which everything emanated and to which everything returns. It is this notion of the people that has been cited as by the resistance to Irish government legislation during the COVID-19 pandemic. Claiming to speak in the name of the people is common to all groups almost who have protested against COVID lockdown measures. A group designating itself as the People's Convention, now we have a screenshot here of it from Twitter, for instance, led the most recent protest against COVID-19 restrictions and mask wearing in Cork on May Day this year. Interestingly, this group representing the people only consisted of 300 protesters. Since traditional, sorry, my text is jumping, I'm so sorry. Since traditional ideas of legitimacy and sovereignty have lost their clear meaning in the shift from transcendent beliefs to secularism, we arrive at the idea that, quote, all power resides in the pouvoir constituant of the people, which means that the democratic notion of legitimacy has replaced the monarchical, end quote. Unfortunately, as Schmitt points out, vesting collective mankind with all legitimacy has two Janus faces, mob rule and democracy. In the Irish context, I really hesitate about talking about this after Eugene has spoken, but in the Irish context, it should be noted that we've only emerged from a 40-year state of exception or emergency in February 1995, with the IRA ceasefire ending a period of emergency that had begun in 1941. So we were in fact longer in a state of emergency than in any quote unquote state of normalcy. And this is because it was armed conflict in Northern Ireland. The only state of emergency or exception to itself that the Constitution recognises is war or armed conflict. And the only item of the Constitution which cannot be overridden by such a state is its ban on capital punishment. But the COVID pandemic is not a state of war in the ordinary sense, at least, so it is not counted as a constitutional state of emergency in Ireland. As such, the measures taken for the sake of public health have been acts of government and must remain within the bounds of the Constitution. Two acts, again, I've jumped, I'm so sorry. Two acts, the Health Act of 2020, Preservation and Protection of Other Emergency Measures in the Public Interest is its full title, and the Emergency Measures in the Public Interest Act, the Emergency Act 2020 are the two acts in question. The Health Act is the more problematic of the two, conferring very wide-ranging powers on the Minister of Health, making him step forward from the generality of the population and the particularity of ministers of state and act as a sovereign. The social distancing measures which fall within his realm of enforcement are seen then by some to violate core Article 46(1) of the Constitution, which is the right to assemble peaceably and without arms. And this has been the main leverage of groups during the COVID crisis, who would also otherwise dispute the validity of the Irish government, which they generally dismiss as corrupt. Amongst them, the so-called People's Convention, mentioned already, which alongside various conspiracy theories espouses the idea that our democracy is fundamentally undemocratic because it is unrepresentative. It declares that this People's Convention, the guiding principle is that sovereignty in Ireland should rest with the people of Ireland and that all affairs of state must be subject to this other mantra, the will of the people, without restriction, and is furthermore subject to the supervision of the people. Similarly, members of Anti-Corruption Ireland, ACI, have been at the vanguard of arguments against COVID provisions, also on the grounds of freedom of assembly. ACI also places its emphasis on the people and designates itself as a citizens' movement. According to Schmitt, these are not outlier ideas. They are spawned by the very constitutional democracy they set themselves over and against, and from which we like to distance ourselves. they merely remove the state as a tertium quid between will and people. The people is the who of the decision, they say, but problematically, the people cannot stand over and above itself. It cannot be sovereign, standing over its collective will. It is, to be Heideggerian about it, itself. This problem, says Schmitt, is fudged by the constitution. He doesn't talk about the Irish constitution, but by constitutions which refer not to the people, but to the state. He sees this as an embodiment, an artificial embodiment, comparing it to Hobbes' Leviathan. It projects the collective into a sovereign body that appears to stand over or around the people. The emergence under COVID conditions of a specific sovereign actor in the form first of Simon Harris as Minister of Health and then Stephen Donnelly clearly localizes the power of the decision, not in the people, but in one who will stand above and decide. Unable to contest the concept of sovereignty itself. And it's always interesting, the distinction between the sovereign and sovereignty. We don't speak about the sovereign, but we will speak very freely about sovereignty. So the groups that set themselves against the COVID restrictions are not able to contest the concept of sovereignty itself because they see the people as sovereign. So they appeal instead against COVID legislation. The appeals have been against COVID legislation in the Irish High Court have been arguments that the laws enacted during COVID were unconstitutional. So it's not so much about the sovereignty of who decides to say this is legal or this is not legal, but rather that the laws are unconstitutional. The recent High Court decision.
Sorry to cut in.
I'm just at the end there. Will I finish up?
If you could just draw to a conclusion.
Yes, I'm almost at the end there. Thanks, Paul. Apologies for that. The recent High Court decision against one such legal challenge by Justice Meenan based itself on the following circular premise. It's required for an applicant for leave to commence judicial review proceedings to demonstrate that an argument can be made which indicates that the argument is not empty. A curious petitio principii or circular argument that makes clear the constitutional conundrum facing the challenging parties. So the Constitution was still fully in operation because the COVID state of exception is not a state of war. The only benchmark here by which the minister's actions could be judged had to be whether the legislation enacted in the name of public health observed proportionality and necessity of emergency measures. In other words, constitutional rights are not absolute, they can be balanced against the common good, and as a result, the state can impose limitations on those rights in a pandemic. The limitations must merely be necessary, rational, and proportionate to the challenges posed based on evidence. The court dismissed the action by John Waters and Gemma O'Doherty of ACI on the basis that they made an overarching claim of unconstitutionality, rather than arguing what is essentially unarguable anyway, the question of necessity and proportionality. If the state of exception is, by Schmitt's definition, unlimited, unbegrenzt, no valid argument of scale can possibly be made. The worrying thing here is not that it was left to two former journalists, John Waters and Gemma O'Doherty of ACI, who are currently exploring the furthest shores of right-wing logic to test the constitutionality of these measures, but rather our failure to admit that the measures in extremis cannot be tested because they are illimited. And it's this important state of affairs that the disease has traced for us all the way to the High Court. Sorry, Paul, for going so much over time. Thank you very much. I just wanted to end with that photo though. Not the flag of the Ivory Coast, just the Irish flag in reverse. And I liked the mirror image that it created. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Rachel.
Thank you.
Our two discussants are Camille Roman and Paul Stenner. Okay, so Camille, do you want to come in first?
Yes, thank you, Paul. First of all, let me just introduce myself. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Camille Roman. I'm a lecturer in sociology and political science at John Cabot University and Lumsa University here in Rome. Let me just state at the beginning of this, I have accessed, I've seen just the first draft of the paper. So this is, that's some new things that I've seen the first time. So naturally, my comments will be more oriented towards the first draft of the paper. The second draft, I saw it only today. So But sorry about that. So I'll try to sort of build in some of the insights I got from the presentations as well. To keep it very short, let me just say I had a great pleasure to read the paper. I found very interesting facts about the history of pandemics and a very, very cogent analysis of Carl Schmitt's understanding of political theology and states of exception. That being said, maybe I almost feel like I would like to push you to reverse the focus of to go back to the previous draft in the sense of to reverse the focus of the endeavor of the paper, because you said that the focus is here to use the states of exception in the coronavirus pandemic to enlighten or to see what does it tell us about the Schmittian analysis of states of exception. And that for me makes it to a very Schmittian paper, whereas I almost feel like I want to push you to do the reverse, to use Schmitt's analysis of states of exception and to enlighten with Schmitt what is most particular or most threatening or most perplexing or most singular about this state of exception and the corona pandemic. That's just as a general comment. Beyond that, either way, it seems to me you can go still to both direction, and maybe you will in like 2 different papers. But beyond that, maybe just 2 or maximum 3 very short comments. The first one is referring to, you talk about the structural similarity between the Dubrovnik case and the current pandemic. That's a very interesting fact. However, as a student of the French Revolution, I would say one of the first things you notice, you need to reflect both about discontinuities and continuities, so about structural similarities, also what is distinct to the past pandemics to the Dubrovnik case. And this is important because it brings to the attention, to the analytical focus, the problem of Carl Schmitt's general framework, which is very targeted on state sovereignty and states of exception, but specifically on the modern state. And this is a critique that has been brought to Schmitt a lot of times in the sense that it is not clear what sovereignty and state of exception mean, not in the sense of how he articulates it, but in the sense of, is this the sovereignty idea and state of exception foundational of the political as such, or is it constitutive merely of the modern form? And this is a big, big problem, I would say, that you might face in the paper because the Dubrovnik case is a 14th century example. And that means that there's basically nobody that I would know of that they would locate modern sovereignty within the 14th century, or the rise of the practice of modern sovereignty, or the philosophy or theory of the modern sovereignty in the 14th century. So I think that needs to be clarified and sort of taken on board a little bit, how you think about Schmitt's understanding of sovereignty and the relation to the political and the modern state. So is it simply foundational of politics in general, of the political, or is it more specific to the modern state? And then that will help you recast somehow, depending how you answer, recast the whole story about the Dubrovnik case, and also the kind of history of the pandemics that I found very interesting, where you talk in the 17th and 18th century about how this becomes an issue in the 16th and 17th century, or say 17 and 18. I'm coming back to that in just a second. So the second point is, that's the first point. The second point is basically building on the first, which is, it seems to me that the clarification needs to be taking place between sovereignty, the political, and states of exception. Like sort of roam around in the paper, and they're very important. But again, either way you're going with the paper, that you want to illuminate the pandemic, or that you want to really write a Schmittian paper on the pandemic and the state of exception, I think these 3 concepts somehow need to be brought in connection with each other. So the political is absent, for example, in the paper, but I find it that it must be somehow there, because it's important to clarify these for yourself, these issues, the relation between state sovereignty, the political, and states of emergency, because they are seen as sort of connected intrinsically by Schmitt, but there is a sort of a lot of pushback from the literature on that. And finally, I make it really fast, Paul. I mean, I'm sorry if I'm already too long. Finally, one important aspect, namely that I see, and this is a personal opinion, this is not touched in the paper, but maybe could be fruitful, in the sense that's normally seen that sovereignty leads to the states of exception. But historically speaking, is in fact the other way around. It's the state of exception that has built up the sovereign practice, or the practice of sovereignty. And here we have, I think, in order to elucidate this question of sovereignty, one needs to sort of tackle the problem of modern political rationalism in general. And this is an extraordinary coincidence, the fact that, for example, Descartes in 1651 publishes his philosophical reflections, and Hobbes in 1651 publishes the Leviathan. This is not simply a coincidence. They are both living through the religious wars of the mid-17th century. And so you have the state of emergency that leads to sort of political rationalism of sovereignty, of the Leviathan, of absolute power, and so on and so on, and the practice of sovereignty. So I think maybe this is a sort of a suggestion of mine, and so it's not, maybe it's not necessary, but I think it would be very fruitful to tackle this question of political rationalism, and how political rationalism and the history of modern political rationalism has in fact built up the history of sovereignty, both as a practice and as a political philosophy.
That's very interesting. I mean, maybe one thing to say there, Camille, is that he operates in a way that is very Heideggerian. So whereas it's his intention to point out something that he claims that we're missing all the time, which is the presence of the sovereign decider, whether you obscure it or make it more obvious, it's always there, it's always happening. So to come maybe to your first point about lineage, he sets up a genealogy of ideas. So effectively saying that this question is an ancient question, it's simply going through different incarnations. It moves from being a theological question through being a question of divine right, through the French Revolution, then becoming a question of the people and who decides. So he has a huge range himself. He doesn't distinguish between, as you put, the differences between 14th century Dubrovnik and the modern state of Weimar, which he's actually talking about. I take your point that one needs to be decisionistic to speak with Carl Schmitt and decide whether one is using Carl Schmitt to understand something, or whether one ends up being, I suppose, persuaded by Schmitt and becoming Schmittian, which is always a huge danger with him, as with Heidegger, that there is a certain, and he would be the first to admit this, there is a certain theological practice to his own jurisprudence, which he declares in a Machiavellian way. This is political theology. So I see all of the points that you mean. I suppose that one of the issues is becoming seduced by the subject that you're writing about. On the question of structural similarity, I think that the question here maybe is one of voice. When am I speaking and when is Schmitt speaking? And I have to admit that by the end of this, I didn't know who was speaking, which is very interesting as well. Because his question is who is deciding, who is speaking, and the obscurity of who is deciding and who is making the edict is what I wanted to bring out with the original Trentino, where it is the Grand Council by a majority of one, which is a very diffuse utterance of sovereignty. So yeah, I think your points are really useful, Camille. Thank you very much. And I'm sorry that I only sent the finished paper late last night. That's when I finished it. Thank you very much for your reading.
Thank you very much. And I'm looking forward to read the whole paper once you've done it. But maybe just to mention, because Bjorn is here, he has a few pages, in fact, on this link between, in his Liminality and the modern book from 2014, and he can confirm that, a few pages on the link between Descartes and Hobbes, and the link between the right of sovereignty or the sovereign state and the sovereign self in Descartes. So I think that would be quite interesting for you to look
yes, into. That's very useful. Thank you. That's actually really useful. Okay. Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Camille. So I'll let in Paul Stainer, who's the second discussant, and Roger Griffin also wants to make a comment on the paper. So I will take both, maybe Rachel, before you give your final contribution.
Thank you for inviting me to do this, and I'm sorry I was a little bit late this morning. I had trouble getting in. I really enjoyed your paper and your presentation, Rachel. I also didn't get much chance to look properly at the final version. I found it very rich and very thought-provoking. I'd like to sort of start just by picking up on what you were talking about at the end, about this sort of phase in which you when writing the paper, sort of found yourself unable to distinguish, who was speaking, you or Schmitt, and who was deciding, you or Schmitt. This idea of this sort of confusion of desires, and that confusion of desires seems to me really a nice way of sort of summarizing sort of the crisis, the liminal crisis that one enters when norms no longer apply, and in a sense you no longer can rely upon the norms that you had been relying upon previously. So the state of exception and those problems with desire are sort of fundamental to this show. I'm approaching this, by the way, as I'm a social psychologist, not a political historian or anything like this. So I'm approaching it in probably a slightly oblique way. But it seems to me, thinking of that issues psychologically, what you see in sort of those crisis situations where normativity breaks down, is a sort of a challenge to how you attribute agency. And I think this is the way that I would sort of cast a lot of what Schmitt is talking about. To attribute agency is to find a person within a situation who you can consider to be responsible for that situation. Now, a lot of the times, the persons that we attribute responsibility to, are fictional. So there's no one-to-one correspondence between the person who is actually in control of the situation and the person to whom we attribute that responsibility. And indeed, in crisis situations, human beings are very prone to do what Bergson calls fabulate. And to fabulate is precisely to project a personality onto the situation in order to make it predictable and manageable, something that we think we can understand, even though what we've done is we've fabulated. He gives the example, Bergson, he calls it the lady in the lift. So there's a lady on the 6th floor of a hotel who is waiting for the lift, and the doors open and she steps in, and then she's flung back by a lift attendant, and only then she gathers herself. She realizes there was no lift attendant, but what had happened was that the lift doors had opened and there was just the chasm underneath. There was no lift there. So somehow she'd sort of noticed this and very quickly fabulated or projected an agency that had saved her from this situation. This for Bergson is a classic example. Yeah. So in some ways, this idea that we sort of project an agency is quite interesting in terms of the psychological aspects of it. And it made me think of the little bits of Schmitt that I've read. He's written an interesting thing about Hamlet. And what he wants to first of all acknowledge when he writes about Hamlet is the liminal situation of crisis into which Hamlet is being written by Shakespeare. So the breakdown in the monarchy, the death of the queen, and the difficulty of finding a replacement for her, and eventually James steps in. And for Schmitt, James is the person for whom Shakespeare's written this play, and Shakespeare knows that James will be sat in the audience watching this play. And the play of Hamlet, of course, is this remarkable sort of scenario whereby, who is deciding in Hamlet? The whole play is like he describes himself as a machine who's sort of acted through by the events, and the whole enigma of the play is that nobody is in a position to make any decisions, and the decision is endlessly deferred, endlessly paused, endlessly, and there's something of that, in the state of exception. So that's really what I wanted to sort of draw attention to, those, if you like, subterranean psychological dynamics at play in these issues.
Extremely useful. Yes, thank you. I mean, I think that the Bergson works extremely well, the idea of fabulation. But I like what you said as well about the moment of seduction, because it is, of course, not just a seduction with Schmitt. The problem is also the seduction of the people by people like Anti-Conspiracy Ireland and the so-called People's Convention, the worryingly called People's Convention. The seduction of ideas is there in the popular far right discourse on COVID. So there are multiple layers of being seduced. If anything, the paper is about being seduced by ideas. And I suppose that's what I liked, the conversion of the question of the parasite or the infection into Hermes and ideas of communication, because really what we're talking about here is how we talk about decisions, how we talk about the sovereign, our willingness to talk about certain things and our absolute refusal to talk about other things. And also the decision, not just on what the state of exception involves, but the decision on who to believe, which is another layer of decisionism that one could talk about, using Schmitt's idea of the friend and the enemy, simply deciding on the enemy. The enemy doesn't have to be a monster, he says, you just have to decide who the enemy is and who the friend is. And more or less, having decided, work on that basis. That's now your tribe and your allegiance, and you'll either believe Gemma O'Doherty that it's a scandemic, or you'll listen to Simon Harris and or Proxy. So I think desire is a very, very useful
sorry again,
concept
Rachel.
Thank you very much,
point,
Paul.
Thank you.
Thank you.